we're being recorded. Okay, excellent. Well, you're very welcome, Peter. Thanks for taking time out to join us on the webinar. And we have a nice audience that's just streaming into the room now. So we'll give it just a minute and we'll kick off. And we're going to talk about you. We're going to talk about big health, and we're going to talk about mental health and digital therapeutics and all kind of related topics. And we'll try and make it as interactive as possible. And we'll try to get a little bit of maybe your backstory and kind of how you see the market at the moment and how you think things are kind of rolling out, and what you're kind of seeing going forward. So we got 35 people in the room. I think we're expecting a few more, but we might as well. Time is precious. You're an entrepreneur, so we might as well get started. And let's start at the start. So before big health, let's go back to your kind of early days, and how did you end up here, and what was kind of, as you were starting out thinking about your career, is this something that you said, hey, I'm gonna go and start digital therapeutics probably didn't even exist back then, so tell us a little bit about that backstory.
No, I did. It was part of the master plan. I was like, to my career advisor, I was like, this is what I want to do. Is great. No, so I mean, I did all sorts of things prior to founding Big Health. I like to say I have the resume of a lunatic. Like, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but probably the most relevant, which is it did directly lead to the foundation of what is now Big Health, was I did my undergrad in experimental psychology. So although I am not a clinician, I'm not a licensed therapist, I do know the science behind non-drug interventions for problems such as insomnia, anxiety, depression, these chronic mental health conditions, and that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is recommended as the first line therapy in many cases for these conditions. So that was like a really relevant grounding, and then winding path that took me via doing like marketing and comm strategy in big ad agencies, through to working with Martha Lane Fox, who again, folks who are in the US won't know of, but in the UK is a very renowned tech entrepreneur. And so sort of a winding path, but really it was my own experience of insomnia that really provoked the idea behind what is now Big Health. And so I was working for Martha at the time, actually in her karaoke business.
Oh, okay. Was that before lastminute.com?
This is after.
Okay, I still have shared lastminute.com, so I need to talk to you about those.
Yeah, so anyone can sort of make their own conclusions about the connection between karaoke and insomnia. Is probably, I'll leave that to everyone's own perspective on how those two things are connected. But yeah, and so developed insomnia, one of the worst experiences of my life, without a doubt. And I'm very, like I say, very fortunate to have had that grounding at undergrad in experimental psychology. And so unlike, I would say, 99% of the population, I knew what the evidence was and what the most effective interventions were. And so this is all back in the UK, went to my GP, very in a very self-satisfied way, announced my self-diagnosis of primary chronic insomnia. I have a degree in this, to the doctor, which obviously doctors love, and requested that I be referred for a course of cognitive behavioral therapy. The GP responded by saying, "Up yours!" Like, here's some sleeping pills, and that's all I could get was the generic Ambien, essentially. And that really is the default experience, that the vast majority, and we'll obviously get into mental health, but I think it's a real blind spot, actually, that like the reality is that for all the talk of psychotherapy, which obviously is powerfully evidence-based, and the importance of getting more people into behavioral health, like human therapy, the truth is that there are many, many, many more people than can ever see a therapist who have mental health problems and end up getting stuck at best in primary care. We know that like 80% of the people with a mental health problem get medications. Like, that is actually the default treatment. And that was my experience as well. So I took the meds, it didn't work. And And as we know, they have very significant side effects and quite unpleasant from a patient experience perspective. And so eventually, out of desperation, I ended up getting my hands on a self-help book, like a self-administered course of cognitive behavioral therapy, written by this world's expert, this guy called Professor Colin Espy. And again, the sort of the deck somewhat stacked in my favor. My sister is a clinical psychologist on the NHS, and so she actually recommended it and was like, "This is a very evidence-based book, like that you can series of books that you can use." So I went through it. It was a tough manual process, but in 6 weeks I was totally cured.
Wow.
Like, totally better.
And how long was it? How long were you kind of between going to the GP and finding the book? How long did that take?
I want to say that, like, because in the scheme of things, my insomnia wasn't even, insomnia is naturally non-remitting. And so that's why you see an increased prevalence up the age spectrum, because people get it and keep it. Like, they don't get rid of don't naturally get rid of it. And so, but mine was, 3-4 months, which is on the short end, actually. Like, you see people who have insomnia for decades, unresolved, and just sort of learn to live with it. But then after that, I want to say probably another couple of months before I was able to actually figure my way through that. And like many people with insomnia had tried everything, had tried like midnight gardening, like to try like chill myself out, and like, you know what I mean, like you sort of become almost like shamanic and going, okay, well, trying to sort of read the runes of like, will tonight be a good night or a bad night? And so you're sort of hypersensitive to looking for signals of what might be predictive or not of being able to address this problem. And so it probably took me another couple of months, but then it was really short. So the beauty of CBT is it's a very short form of intervention that can deliver very significant sustained results. And so, like I say, about 5-6 weeks, I was back to sleeping normally, should we say, sleeping healthily.
And I guess I haven't experienced it myself, but anytime I go without sleep for whatever reason, I find it very hard to function properly. So I can only imagine that it kind of builds on itself, and then it can start to create all sorts of other, challenges and issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as again, my now co-founder, because likes to say, like, think of an area of your life that sleep doesn't affect. Yeah. There isn't one, really. It's like your productivity, your concentration, your mood, as a result, your relationships, like, everything, like your physical health, obviously it's a knock-on effect. And so it really opened my eyes to also the interconnectedness between these issues, so, which again is intuitive. Like, if you can't sleep, of course, it's reasonable to expect your mood the next day is going to be significantly affected. Yeah. If you're anxious, then that will also, if you're less likely to sleep the following night. So it opened my, like, to your point, I think any of these conditions can very rapidly sort of unravel a lot of, and that's, I think, this sort of, from an individual perspective, the really striking thing is, like, how quickly some of the fundamentals, your foundations, can be knocked out from under you, and that sense of, like, why can't I, like, in effect, learned helplessness, like, I can't solve it, like, yes, what's wrong with me? Like, this is like, why can't, is everyone asleep? Everyone can sleep. Like, why can't I solve this problem? So I think, as we'll get into, I think that, like, patient perspective, like, has really served us well in terms of the way that we've thought about, like, approaching, tackling that problem.
Yeah. And as you spend, if you're lucky, maybe you spend a third of your life asleep. I mean, we still know so little about it, but it's such a big portion of our lives that we don't really understand, right? It's still kind of, there is some science around it, but it is still very misunderstood or lacking understanding. So you went through that, because your own determination and connections and background, you could find non-drug solutions and came out of the back of that. But then you had kind of decided, okay, I'm gonna go and try and help other people. So what was the spark for moving from your old job to, okay, I'm going to take the plunge? And tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, it was actually, it's like I said, this book was very, did the trick, and it literally felt like magic. Like, I knew the science, I knew the sort of theory behind it. I'd never witnessed in practice. And for those that haven't experienced it, CBT is a sort of broad collection of evidence-based techniques and approaches and interventions. I like to think of it as like evidence-based common sense. right? Like its great power is that it is very, non-mystical. It's very pragmatic. It's like a skills-based model, right? Which is about like, how do we empower someone to tackle their own problems? And so for me, it was a really inspiring experience, and also like opened my eyes to this totally crazy situation, which is that hundreds of millions of people across the world are suffering from these chronic like mental health problems for which we have these evidence-based solutions that we've known about for like 30 years, 30, 40 years. Like there's hundreds of randomized control trials showing that these solutions are radically more effective and safer than anything else, right? In many cases, or at least as good as, right? Like the alternatives without many of the side effects or downsides. And so, and yet, despite that, no one can get it. No one can access, and the vast majority of people are excluded from, a really effective, evidence-based and safe mental health care. And so that's really what sparked the thought, which was like, how can we bridge that gap? And as you rightly say, the term digital therapeutics was not a thing back then. And digital health was barely a term. I mean, I think maybe you and I were talking about it, but I don't think like there was many other people. And this is back in London. And so, the idea was really first principles, which was, can we take these evidence-based non-drug interventions for mental health and fully automate them? Can we remove the human entirely, deliver a pure software solution? And as a result, can we deliver those therapies as scalably and consistently as medications? And that was really that was always the sort of the core of the idea. And so with that in mind, I then, rang up the guy that wrote the book that cured me, Professor Espy, put on a suit and tie, jumped on a plane to go and see him. And yeah, he became my co-founder. And so he's at the University of Oxford, one of the world's leading behavioral sleep scientists, with 40 years of clinical academic research, really helped found the science in insomnia in particular. And we built the company together. Like it's been a very productive partnership since that day.
And you very successfully went and got Index it was probably their first digital health investment, I think, and I'd probably class them as one at the time, maybe still probably one of the leading, if not the leading European VCs. How did you manage to convince them that, you're going to be able to change the GP who was prescribing drugs to a new way of thinking?
It was, I actually have to give credit. I give credit to Index on this front, like genuinely. And like, Neil Reimer, who then joined our board subsequently, I think has shown to have a track record of like being, very visionary in terms of, being able to look ahead and sort of see the path forward, more broadly. And yeah, like he sort of keyed into that concept, like exactly as I just explained it now. It's sort of the fundamentals of like the disparity between supply and demand and the ability to, this different modality. So yeah, I actually give credit to Index for having that sort of vision. We were indeed like the first health investment that they made, and yeah, it served us very well. It's because of that, Index getting involved that allowed us to make the move to the US. And that's really what I think facilitated that.
Okay, super. So what I'd like to do then is maybe accelerate through the next 10 years, about 10 years.
Yeah, cool.
So maybe in 5 minutes, we can
I'm down for that.
Bring us up to today, right? So give us a sense of, from having been the guy who experienced it to saying, hey, I'm going to get the professor and I'm going to get Index and I'm going to start the company. And now I'm on the entrepreneurial, I'm the founder or co-founder, I'm leading this commercial activity to where you are today. Could you just give us a little bit of a snapshot of some of those ups and downs?
Yeah, I went to sleep, woke up, and here we are today. So it was
walk in the park.
Yeah, I give the high level point. So we developed the first version of the first product, Sleepio, what we would now refer to as a digital therapeutic for insomnia and poor sleep. And actually from out the gate, as it the first placebo group randomized control trial, which was peer reviewed and published. We did all of that like before we took anything out commercially. which again, I give credit to Colin for, like in terms of Professor Espy, because he was from day one, like the ambition here and the opportunity is to deliver digital therapeutics, at the same scale as pharma, like that's what we're doing here, is with the aspiration of it being, truly a therapeutic, and so therefore we should be holding ourselves to the same high levels that any therapeutic would be holding themselves to in terms of safety and effectiveness, and demonstrating that. And so we had the first version, the first product, we had the first clinical studies conducted, and then, really struggled candidly in the UK to get it to work commercially. And we tried all sorts of different approaches, learned a lot, got real conviction around the right path being for it to be a reimbursed solution, as in the same way that any therapeutic would be. And realized that actually a move to the US was going to be necessary in order to unlock that opportunity. And again, I'm very proud to be an NHS Innovation Fellow. I think the NHS is one of the wonders of the world. But more so than today, it was incredibly challenging to get innovation, from a commercial perspective in the UK by the NHS at the time. I think it's improved a lot, but back then it was like, if you remember, it was just like, it was completely opaque. There's no sort of
nowhere to go or who to talk to, right?
Yeah, and because taxpayer funded health system, which is magical, means that there's even fewer options in terms of how you can make, with the single payer, make money in a commercial sense viably. So we made the decision to come to the US. That was, I want to say, 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, and then it just really started to take off. And so we, cut forward to today, we've got coming up to 10 million covered lives globally. That is to say, populations where whoever is paying for their healthcare costs is, reimbursing our digital therapeutics, both Sleepio and Daylight, focused on insomnia, poor sleep, worry and anxiety. And, we're up to 60 plus peer-reviewed publications, 13 randomized control trials. And, a lot of that success has obviously been mediated, which we can dig into via the PBMs here in the US. So partnership with CVS Health, CVS Caremark, the largest PBM with 100 million covered lives. And a lot of that has been through driving coverage through employer-sponsored health plans here. And the way I would characterize it is that it feels now, and I know there's a bunch of others probably on the call who are also involved in this industry, is that all it took was a global pandemic, right, in order to really unlock the potential. And so in retrospect, I think we were probably 10 years early, on this opportunity. And I think that if I had to draw a curve of the last 10 years, it'd be no one understands, no one understands, no one cares, no one cares, everyone cares. So I do think that it feels like now is the moment actually where there's an acknowledgement of not just the opportunity, but the need for these, transformative models of care to meet the huge level of need out there in the population. The traditional models, even leverage with technology, are not going to be sufficient. Yeah. So I think that brings us up to date. Yeah. There you
go. 4 minutes or something. Yeah, so I think that's a good way of thinking about it. A couple of things I wanted to kind of dig into. I guess the appetite in the US versus in the UK or Europe to try new things. And I know that I thought I knew the US. I've been there going back and forth for 20 years, and then I spent a year living there and kind of realized how much I didn't understand the health system there. It's only when you're using it yourself you kind of realize just how fragmented and complicated it is. But on the other hand, it's also probably much more open to innovation. So I'd love to just get your perspective on, you've successfully done deals with the NHS and with CVS and in the US in general. Maybe just how you think about those markets would be good, and given post-pandemic, or wherever we are now in this pandemic, how you think about the two markets, and be really interested to kind of dig into that.
Yeah, and I think it's evolved a lot in that time period. Because as you say, we now focus on both the US and the UK. We have a lot of traction in both markets. Yes, the US market, when I landed, we landed here in the US, funny accents, didn't know anybody, thought we knew about, I'd read a book or something on US healthcare. And the best way I can describe it is it feels to me is like healthcare is a bit like a fractal. It's like the closer that you get, you think, oh, I've got it sorted out. And then the closer you get, you're like, there's more complexity. Like, and so every inch you get closer, you realize there's more and more nuance and exceptions and, you know, and subtlety to it. But I would say at a high level, obviously you only have to look at the total spend per capita to see that there's radically more inefficiency in the US health system than basically anywhere else in the world. And as you say, because it's essentially been an organically evolved health system, you know, where the market has driven it, it's incredibly fragmented, but also culturally, much more than the UK, a place where, you know, obviously it's true of the US in general, where people understand that money is a key part of the equation. And again, this may be alien to folks who are in the US and don't know the UK system, but one of the features of the NHS is that, you know, so many people involved in it do it for the love and do it for the passion. And, you know, people who are doctors and nurses in the NHS, to put it this way, it's not a path you choose if you want to be rich, right? Like if you want to optimize for earnings. And there's a very deeply held culture, which is that the money is like a sort of dirty word. Like it's something that isn't spoken about, and commercial interests are viewed with a great suspicion. And there's a huge degree of protectiveness around this concept of like privatizing the NHS, which I think is really great and is a part of what's protected it, but it makes it very, very challenging, like just at a cultural level, to kind of, as a commercial entity, to do business, you know, and it takes a long time to win the trust of the key stakeholders in the NHS. And so in the US, my experience was, you know, really refreshing in the sense of, point one, there's so many opportunities for the system to drive efficiency. Like we can, you know, it's really significant deltas that you can drive in terms of ROI. And secondly, you can talk about money, and you can say, like, here's how we're going to monetarily help you, even though this is in the world of healthcare. And because of the fragmentation, it actually produces so many more interfaces that, you know, so many potential models, like, you know, different people who might pay for it. So it actually, you know, I found it to be much more, for all its dysfunction, and perhaps slightly because of its dysfunction, the US would just prove to be a much more fertile place to like crack the code of how to actually make it commercially viable and sustainable.
Okay, good. We're getting some questions coming in as we're going, Peter. So one that kind of builds off that is, you know, do you see this as moving towards a consumer model as a viable business case, or do you think it's more of a payer model? And you know, kind of they're asking a little bit about your thoughts about Europe versus US or UK.
Yeah, so the conclusion that I came to through the work in the UK, because we actually, one of the things we did, went direct to consumer. We did we had a deal with Boots, the chemist, which you all in the UK will know about, but we had like a physical box product in like 100 stores in the UK, like it was like, which didn't work. And, you know, but was a part of the sort of learning process. And what I realized, there's some subtlety to this, like our mission at Big Health is to help millions back to good mental health. Right? No asterisk, no small print. Right. Given my experience and Colin's, you know, great passion for the space, like that is the North Star that we organize every decision that we make in the business. And if that really is true, then we need to be commercially incented to help people get healthy as quickly as possible. It sounds kind of obvious, right? And I realized that, you know, there are ways of making consumer, call it just broadly health and wellness products, particularly in mental health work. We've seen great success stories there. But I'm pretty convinced that the only commercial model there is a subscription model. Mm-hmm. Like that's really the predominant, should we say, maybe not the only, but the predominant model that has seen success. And so my issue with that is that, therefore, if that's the model we follow, we're no longer incented. We're incented to keep people on treatment. It's really a big term, but like, you know, engage, like that's how which is at odds with really what the power of a lot of these interventions is, which is a short form of intervention, empowers you to then be your own therapist for years, you know? And so I realized, you know, very tortuously that our customer, therefore, is not the end consumer. It's whoever economically benefits from that person being healthy as quickly as possible. And so that is whoever pays their healthcare costs. And so in the UK, it's the NHS. In the US, it's the whole spectrum of small p payers who pay the $3.5 trillion a year in healthcare costs. And so my own view, it's very, very, just to say, like digital therapeutics, my view is that there is no one model. Right. It's as heterogeneous as all of healthcare, different condition areas with different risk benefit profiles, different dynamics will lend themselves to different distribution models, different reimbursement models. And so all I can say is that in the disease, the areas that we operate, then, the right thing is for this to be, especially with huge access issues and like inclusion and equity issues, then like it being fully paid for by the payer is, I think, the right model.
Getting lots of questions coming in, which is great. So I'm trying to kind of parse them and segment them in. So here's one I think that builds off that. In the US, did you stumble upon you talked about Bupa in the UK, but in the US, did you stumble upon the employer route first of all, or was it serendipity, or kind of how did you kind of navigate your way through?
I mean, there's a heavy dose of serendipity in all of it. So I think as much as I'd like to sort of post-rationalize it to make myself look like a genius, like actually there's a lot of like blind luck and trial and error. Yeah, we just candidly, like when we first came to the US, it was as crude as going, we had this insight that like, okay, like it's the economic buyer here needs to be the person who is incented to keep their people, their members, like as healthy as quickly as possible. And so we only had the vaguest sense that the employers would be potentially a good avenue for that. We didn't really candidly understand the full nuances we do now around that market. And yeah, we just were able to start landing a few of these large employers, within that first year of being here. And then it just, rolled from there. And so, it really is a market where candidly, like just being a high quality partner counts for a lot, like delivering value, doing what you say you're going to do, like genuinely acting in their interests helps you build, trust with those partners. And like any market, it's a small world, and like, word of mouth and referrals count for a lot as well. So it was there's a bit of a rationale to it, but we certainly didn't know what we know now in terms of the nuance of that market. So there was a heavy dose of luck as well.
Okay, very good. Coming back to your kind of point about you don't want to be a subscription model because you're kind of keeping the person on. You want them to go through it, be healthy, kind of move on, right? And obviously then, your revenue stops at the point of, they become, they're well again, right? So, that's a really interesting space to be in. And you look at all the conversations that are going on around the very complex therapies, that the drug companies are charging, an awful lot of money for. How do you think about that, the pricing model, given that you pay for a certain period and then it's not a kind of ongoing recurring revenue?
I think the beauty of digital therapeutics is the degree of flexibility that we have. I think the way I viewed it is that job number one is to establish like pathways of contracting and payment that get everybody, the market payers, comfortable with the idea of this being a true therapeutic. So a lot of the work that we've done through the PBM is related to that. Actually, it's as much about let's call it positioning and kind of as it is about the mechanics of distribution and billing and so forth. So job one has been, for me anyway, just like establishing that this is something which should be evaluated, treated broadly in the same way as any other therapeutic. I think where we go from there, the world is our oyster. I think that unlike other classes of therapeutic, we have a lot of advantages, right? We have such rich data, which affords us the opportunity to further double down on this connection, alignment of incentives. So, what I would love to see is that the whole industry moving even further towards, being paid based on outcome and based on sustained outcomes, right? So I think there are ways in which, wouldn't it be great if, all of us were for the sake of patients, and we are the patients at the end of the day, like our mothers, our brothers, our daughters, our sisters, right, are the patients. Wouldn't it be great if the people delivering that healthcare like a real economic incentive to keep you healthy with a minimum of treatment, right? And so like, I think that I can foresee a world, I think this is about maturity of the industry. I think we're going to get to a point where like, we do see more of these like longer term payment models where they are connected to outcomes versus just the amount of treatment that you deliver. And, I would love to see that being the sort of the basis on which the industry is competing.
Really cool. Let's go back to your GP in the UK.
Yeah.
Today, would he be prescribing a digital therapeutic, do you think, or how broad is the message getting? The research has been around for years, as you say, but like just that awareness hasn't been, and the solutions haven't been. How far down the road do you think we are in terms of kind of broad adoption of these technologies?
Yeah, I think you were talking about not being able to come to the US. I also haven't been able to come out to the UK for at least a couple of years. So like, this is a little bit, this will be slightly out of date or like secondhand knowledge, but, Sir Bruce Keogh, who was the, medical director of the NHS for 10 years, very fortunate to class him as one of our advisors. And he classed it as saying, 10 years of change has happened in 3 months, in the health system following the pandemic. What I would say is that even the data prior to the pandemic illustrated that there is an assumption that GPs, particularly in the UK, are kind of Luddites and that they are sort of resistant to technology. The reality is that they are humans and they all have smartphones, and like there is at least a strong signal that there is a latent desire and understanding to want to use technology to ultimately, doctors want to help their patients, right? And so we've actually had a lot of success in the UK developing models which are integrated into primary care very effectively, where we've seen like GPs want to have options. They want to have options to refer. The challenge is often how you bridge both intention and also then the workflow. Like, how do you actually make it something that is feasible for doctors to refer? We have it with a study that just came out that was published around our work in the NHS, where looking at IAPS, right, which is the increasing access to psychological therapies, centralized program in the UK for delivering psychological therapies, and that was showing how our digital therapeutic work alongside therapy. And it was awesome to see a significantly greater remission rate for individuals who are on both versus just therapy. Right? So I think there is, as we see more of this data come out from real world implementations, I think that counts for a lot in the sort of GP and doctor community. So that specific doctor, who knows? But I think that the overarching data suggests that that tide is turning, and I think it is a bottom-up thing. I think it's like doctors are people too, and everyone is more comfortable with digital models of care.
Yeah, it feels like, going back 5 years ago, mental health was really something that wasn't really talked about. There wasn't a lot of money being put into it. It wasn't cool to talk about it, et cetera, et cetera. But that seems to have changed, and you see the amount of investment that's got venture capital money that's gone into the space, into digital health and into mental health. And so it feels like the tide is turning a little bit. And I think, COVID has kind of been an accelerator to that. But what we see, lots of companies raising lots of money, right? And a very busy marketplace. How do you kind of stand out, and how does big health stand out in, that? I know you guys have been around for a long time and you have evidence, but how do you kind of position in that busy marketplace?
I think point one, I think we're seeing at speed a segmentation of the overall mental health, call it market, which is symptomatic of, as you say, this rapid acceleration of it being prioritized and like unignorable as like a problem. And so I would say that here's at least the categories that I see, right? So I think the first wave in mental health was very understandably about taking the traditional models of human delivered therapy and like using technology to extend access and reach. And so essentially like telehealth, telepsych, a lot of these other platforms that center on humans as a delivery model, which is important, and it's an important first step, but it's only ever going to be like an incremental gain versus however much you leverage those therapists, we've still run out of therapists. There aren't enough therapists, and there never will be, right? And so that's all we're seeing. These models already kind of topping out in terms of the actual therapy component. We can add coaching and content and stuff, but the actual therapy component is topping out. And even with telehealth, you're getting waiting lists and big wait times and so forth. So that's one category, very important, but it's only ever going to reach a subset of the population. On the other end of the spectrum, you have what I consider to be like sort of wellness or like preventative interventions, right? So this is just sort of, you can think about these consumer apps that like focus on mindfulness, very important role, but they're not, clinical interventions. They're not appropriate for delivery against people with a clinical need. And so bang in the middle is where I think digital therapeutics in general, like are increasingly carving out a clear role in the minds of the market, which is, there's this huge swathe of people who still need help, who, like I say, today, the only solution they have that's sufficiently scalable is medication. That's the only alternative. And so that is where I think that digital therapeutics broadly, that is to say, pure software solutions that actually are appropriate and deliver clinical effects, clinically meaningful effects, can be deployed at scale. And so point one is I think that we're seeing a lot more definition around the overall mental health market. Secondly, within that, as you say, we're doing this a long time, healthcare isn't fast. And I think that, I'm very proud of the sort of overwhelming clinical evidence base that we've collected. We're featured in the clinical guidelines, American College of Physician guidelines. That counts for a lot in healthcare and in terms of reimbursement decision-making, partnerships and so forth. And because we've been doing it, for such a long period of time, we've been able to refine a lot of the deployment models, distribution models at very significant scale now. And so I think that, I think that that's really what we're seeing as being the as the big differences in terms of us versus other folks that are engaged in tackling this problem.
Yeah, and to kind of layer another level of complexity on top, I mean, a lot of the people who can benefit from these solutions are the underserved populations, right? How do you think about your commercial models in relation to those communities?
Our mission is to help millions back to good mental health. Like I say, no asterisk, no small print. And I take that very seriously, as you say, that if we're not actively engaging underserved populations, then we are phonies. We're not being true to that mission. And so myself and Colin, my co-founder, actually published I think, hopefully quite crisp and thorough commitment to mental health equity several months ago, which was built in consultation with a number of external experts in the field, with some very concrete goals and commitments around it. And so you can see there like the commitment to extending access to underserved communities as part of what we do. And I think it's part and parcel of what I see as being the sort of meta opportunity or imperative here, which is we have an opportunity as an industry to shape the next generation of healthcare. And there is, if one will forgive a somewhat non-medical term, but there is a question here about the fight for the soul of this industry. And so I think that, I certainly feel a lot of responsibility, maybe is a big word, but like a real drive to try and establish some principles that really do act in the best interests of as many people as possible, So we put out that public commitment. A big part of that is holding us accountable to that. But it really is going to require like an overall industry mindset to really make a big dent in that problem.
Do you think the existing players of the life sciences companies, etc., will play a significant role here, or do you think it will be companies like yourselves who will come forward and kind of create a new model, I guess?
I mean, I'd love it. I'd love it if this is like if that were the case, and it's an open invitation. Like, please, any pharma, life sciences companies that are interested in figuring out together how to radically shift the inequities in particularly mental health care, which are huge. Please let me know. I would love to talk about it, because I think this is that's ultimately, like I say, what this is about is, you know, for all the complexity and business models, and like ultimately this is about, I think most people I talk to in this, you know, in healthcare in general, are in it because of the motivation to actually make things better for people.
Yeah, perfect. So we're 45 minutes in, Peter, and there's loads of questions coming in.
Yeah.
Loads of questions, but so I'd like to ask you one more from my side, and then I want to kind of go through the ones that have come in. So talk a little bit about evidence generation, and you know what you've kind of learned in the various RCTs you run, and what you'd advise maybe others in the space in terms of how to approach it. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Totally, yeah. So again, I give all the credit to this to my co-founder Colin, you know, professor at Oxford University, you know, really from day one, more from a values-based perspective, was like, we need to do the work to make sure that this is, you know, we're confident of the safety and efficacy and effectiveness of our solutions. And so he set rolling what is now this sort of runaway train of a research program that just gets faster and faster. So as I mentioned before, you know, we have now, like, I want to say 64 publications. It's getting bigger and bigger every day. You know, that includes 13 randomized control trials, a stat that still blows my mind. More participants have taken part in controlled studies of sleep-EO than have ever taken part in studies of Ambien, right? According to the clinical guidelines, right?
Yeah, so, that's a good one.
You know, but and I think, you know, you can sort of read that two ways. You can go, well, you know, it's a testament to, I think, our research program. It's also raises some serious questions about, you know, the research program around some of these medications, you know, that have been around for a long time. So, you know, it's significant. We have another, I want to say 30, 40 studies that are currently in flight. And, you know, a big part of that has been the quality of the research that we've done in terms of collaborators. About half our studies are independently led. You know, we publish in JAMA, Lancet Psychiatry, like the top journals in the world. And that is really what directly has led to us being cited in leading clinical guidelines across the world, you know, ranging from American College of Physicians through to NICE in the UK. And, you know, like I say, the evidence, the point about like evidence really is just the right thing to do all around. Like there's like, you look at it from any angle, it's the right thing to do, right? In terms of like duty of care to, you know, patients and the public, but also commercially. Like if, you know, for me, it's always been clear that if you look at precedent, if you look at the way that pharma has evolved and, you know, the rails that, you know, I have a lot of respect for pharma and what they've been able to demonstrate and achieve, and I think we can learn a lot in both directions from their examples. But, you know, outcomes is what gets paid for, and being able to demonstrate those outcomes is what's really key. And so, so I think, you know, my advice to anyone would be, it's the right thing to do to focus on clinical evidence. I remember back when we were, you know, me, Martin, like back in the day, the big debate was, you know, those involved in digital health in general, like, oh, we can't do it, it's too expensive, it's unreasonable. And I was just like, roll my eyes. I'm like, you're in the wrong game. Like, you know what I mean? Like, as like, if you're not like,
that was certainly the mindset going back 10 years, kind of the Facebook, you know, move fast and fix it after, you know, and you could see the doctors wincing in the corner going, that's not going to work, guys, you know?
That
was the,
and so I think
a little bit as an industry.
Totally right. I don't think anyone thinks that now, you know. I think people are, obviously it's great to see that this being much more the norm. But anyway, I just think it's like critical all around. And I think, you know, hopefully we're an example of showing that it's feasible. Like it doesn't, you know, and there's ways of doing this that are very sort of cost effective and efficient and fast. And, you know, a lot of the sort of assumptions about evidence don't have to hold true, I don't think. You know, I think we should be striving to innovate in models of evidence collection the same way we innovate in every other domain.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. Okay, so that's my questions. Let's have a look and see what's come in. So a few of them here. Yeah, this one is interesting. So it's talking about elderly care, and do you think the GP shall prescribe a DTX for sleep problems, another DTX for depression? So do you think they'll kind of prescribe two different DTXs? And for example, in elderly care, you know, you sometimes have patients who are then also taking a number of other medicines for comorbidities. And how would you, that's a complicated one. How would you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's still an open question. I mean, definitely the existing rails and kind of models that people have in healthcare lean towards having separate therapeutics per condition, like that, or indication, should we say? Like that's kind of the rails that exist already. That's the mindset and the way that things are set up. It, of course, isn't the way that digital therapeutics have to do. There's more flexibility in digital therapeutics. So I think if you ask me today, I would say yes. There's probably going to be more of a sort of portfolio of of interventions for different indications. I think elderly care is obviously a related point. I think it's a good example of what I was saying earlier about how there's no one size fits all model in digital therapeutics, because as we said, as this question highlights, there's a huge need in the elder. Just take insomnia, like highest prevalence groups are the elderly, and we know that it's a great entry point in order to deliver all sorts of positive secondary and tertiary downstream outcomes. But we know that our solutions are effective in elderly populations, but at scale, do we need different models in combination with providers to be able to actually make sure that those patient groups are able to use those digital therapeutics effectively? So in terms of like that particular group, yeah, I think it's a really good open question about how one needs to adapt the model in order to really reach that. And that's true of a ton of other subgroups in the population who might need slight adjustments to the model in order to get them effective care.
Okay, and kind of building all of that, then there's a question here from Tim, which is in relation to kind of cultural elements and, for example, in Asian markets, Japan, China, South Korea. So I guess Tim is kind of asking about how do you think about the cultural elements and how do you adapt, or is that part of how you guys?
Yeah, it's a big part of the need to get a breadth of evidence across a breadth of populations, to triangulate, and have an open mind as to like, in which populations do we see stronger or weaker effects? And as a result, where do we need to focus our energies in terms of making any given intervention, culturally responsive? We've at Big Health, developed a cultural responsiveness framework that is driving all of our product development processes, as well as a research protocol to drive like inclusion in delivery of research. We're actually going to publish it, and folks can essentially open source it, utilize that model and that framework in their own research. So what we do know, we today, we have some Big Health, some pretty good data spanning different demographic groups, different cultural groups, and we do see really good, in general, like good overall effectiveness, independent of some of those factors and demographic factors. Beyond that, you talk about these different territories, again, there's good existing evidence behind broadly cognitive and behavioral approaches across cultures. Like it does need cultural adaptation, but it's not like we see, those cultural differences having a huge effect on the effectiveness of these interventions. So there is reason to believe that these are approaches that will be globally relevant and effective.
You talked earlier about the kind of the segmentation of the market and the different kind of categories. How far do you think digital therapeutics and prescription digital therapeutics can go in terms of some of the bigger mental health challenges we have? So when we think about sort of a spectrum of severity, like how far do you think they can go on their own? And then, how far do you think they can go alongside a kind of traditional pharmacological solution?
Yeah, again, I think that there's going to be a spectrum of answers to that question. So like in the areas, we are very consciously focused on these very high prevalence chronic, mental health issues, which we know respond very well to these interventions. And we know that for many of these areas, these sort of risk benefit profile affords us the ability to deliver without a prescription. Like that's been our approach in the main, is the issue is an access issue, and it's a scale problem. Like it's just a volume problem. You talk about, in other domains of mental health, like schizophrenia, these which have a very different profiles, and like a different risk profiles, and patient needs. And so I think that, in that instance, it can be fully appropriate that like there's a prescription to mediate it, and perhaps there's even like a support model that goes alongside, some of these interventions. And so I think that like, maybe it's alongside medications, it's a sort of joint adjunctive intervention. And so the key point here is that what is true across the spectrum is that the digital therapies, insofar as I've been able to see, have evidence of being able to increase the quality of care and the efficiency of care, irrespective of the way in which they're combined. So I've already, I talked about in the UK, like we've been offered alongside, human delivered therapy and been able to demonstrate in the wild, like significant increases in total remission rates versus just humans alone. And so the point is that whatever the combination, the digital therapeutic is gonna be a positive net effect on effectiveness and efficiency.
Okay, that's cool. I'm gonna think we have time for about 2 more questions. So this one comes in from Sonia. What is your experience with recruitment for your trials?
Mm-hmm.
What are your channels? How do you go about recruiting people for your trials?
Yeah, so we've got really good at this, and like you'll see in a lot of our studies, all of which are published, and you can find them on our bighealth.com, is we've conducted some really large studies, like multi-thousand N participant, controlled trials. And so it speaks to some of the benefit of a digital therapeutic. You can use purely digital means to reach participants and to enroll them, engage them, and actually then to manage the intervention. And often, obviously, different protocols have different trials have different designs, but it can be a real benefit in terms of it being more equivalent to a real world deployment if those participants are acting at arm's length, right? That if they are essentially self-guiding through the program, that also helps with trial efficiency. So we've been progressively tuning it, but we've now been able to, through a lot of these like digital channels, be able to get like very, very efficiently now and very quickly recruit sometimes like thousands of participants in a very short period of time.
Okay, that's super. So there's lots of questions here I didn't get to, unfortunately. We're almost at time. I have one which I didn't give you a heads up on, so this is a bit of a. But if we ask all our guests if they weren't doing what they were doing today in another world or another life, if they weren't running their companies or running their funds or whatever, what would they be doing? So Peter, if you weren't running Big Health, what would you be doing?
I mean, maybe I'd probably still be in the karaoke industry. Maybe I'd be running my own bar at this point. I don't know. I hope like that's probably not the case. I honestly don't know. I think I would be, let's go with that. I'll be in the karaoke industry.
Okay, that's a good answer. I'd take that. All right, well, look, we're almost there. Just wanted to announce that we're delighted, and maybe Niamh, you can share the screen. We're delighted to be launching our mental health community, our digital mental health community, and delighted that Peter is going to continue to participate. So, as most people know, these type of events are just the start, hopefully, the start of making connections and creating more collaboration. So what we're trying to do is capture some of what Peter shared today and provide a platform to continue those conversations. And so this is the platform, as you can see. And if we scroll up to the top, you can see the curated news. You can see the meetings that are coming up. We're hosting them on a fairly regular basis. And there's 12 meetings in the pipeline. And so this is a great way of, I mean, just encourage people who are on the call today to check it out. You can join the community, and that's a great way of kind of seeing what's happening with the Big Health story and the rest of the community. So just do a quick shout out to that. We'll share the link. Maybe we can share the link in the chat here if people want to participate. Otherwise, Peter, it's been a blast.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it, and I learned so much. And I'm a big karaoke fan, as my team knows. So there's another connection, another set of conversations that we'll have. Hopefully,
Maybe a separate community. HealthXL community.
Maybe we can merge the two. Maybe there's a therapeutic effect, some type of trial we can do around it, and
There we go.
put us together. Yeah. So just on behalf of everybody, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule, and it's been really fun and educational and